Late in the dry season, in Florida's Everglades, life clusters around the deep water pools. All around stretch the empty sawgrass prairies. The water is shallow here now. In places, it's dried up completely. But for 10 months in the year, the Everglades are, or used to be, a river of grass. From Lake Okeechobee, the water flowed south at a steady 1 kilometer a day, a shallow river 60 kilometers wide, seeping through the sawgrass to the mangrove swamps that fringe Florida Bay. But that was 100 years ago. Now, the Everglades are dying.
The number of wading birds, herons, egrets, storks, and ibises, nesting birds have declined by 90%. The number of alligators may have declined by 75 to 90%. The seagrass beds in Florida Bay have had massive die-offs. We've got serious phosphorus contamination. We've got serious mercury contamination in the system. We've got invasion of a lot of exotic plants and fishes, including a lot of exotic plants out of Australia that are showing up all through the system. The huge question is, can we reverse these, or have some of these things been lost forever?
All along the fringes of the Everglades, dense thickets of Australian melaleuca trees, sown decades ago in a careless experiment, crowd out all native life. The melaleucas are bad enough for the Everglades, but what's really messed the system up were the giant engineering projects from earlier in the century. This is the Tamiami Trail. In the 1920s, the US Army Corps of Engineers dug the canal, built the dike, put the road on top of it, and drove it 180 kilometers from Miami in the east all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And what that did was to block the river of grass completely. And the Tamiami Trail was only the start of it. For the next 50 years, dikes and canals were driven through the Everglades, draining land for orange groves and sugar plantations in the north, providing fresh water and flood protection for a megalopolis of 6 million people, which has sprung up along the Atlantic coast. The flora and fauna of one of the world's great wetlands came second to making a buck.
You know, the value systems were different in the 1920s and even into the 40s. When the current project was authorized, there was a different set of priorities by the people of Florida and the people of the nation. And the Everglades was just something in the way. They didn't even know what was in the middle of the Everglades, and there were arguments about what the middle of the Everglades was like. You'd say, for God's sake, didn't they have airplanes and go out there and look? But they didn't seem to know. And they just, you know, it was all engineering, build a road across the Everglades.
In the 20s, of course, they did have aircraft, but they didn't have airboats. And so for years they didn't know that hidden on islands in the River of Grass lived the only remnants of the great Creek Confederacy still surviving east of the Mississippi. They fled here from the north in the early 1800s, and here the Miccosukee Indians lived on fish and venison and duck, and corn that they cultivated on these tiny fertile islets.
Sometimes 2 families, 3 families live together on a little island like this. We have a canoe to move around in it. We want to go visit another village, maybe 2, 3 miles, 4 miles. We get in the canoe, go visit all day.
Buffalo Tiger was born on an island just like this in the 1920s. He still remembers an idyllic childhood that his grandchildren will never know.
We used to have it every winter. We have a lot of ducks coming down. I mean, all, you ought to see the sky this time of day, you could see a lot of birds flying all over because it's time to go home and sleep. But you don't see that happen too many times.
Nowadays, buffalo tiger keeps this island up just to show the tourists.
Well, right now, people are not living in places like this now because it's so hard to find a good water out here. Water pollution is one thing that's hurting our people. It is in the farming area north from here, beautiful sugar farming, and then maybe orange groves, all those places that use a lot of chemicals. And when they get here, it's pretty polluted.
For decades, what Floridians call big sugar, the companies that own the sugar plantations in the Everglades agricultural area, have been buying favors in Tallahassee, the state capital, and in Washington, D.C. Campaign donations flowed north, tariffs and tax breaks flowed south. And nitrogen and phosphorus from the sugar fields poured into the Everglades wetlands. But these days, big sugar isn't the only one with big bucks to throw around. On reservation land on the edge of the Everglades, within easy reach of Miami, the Miccosukee have built a casino which pulls in around $20 million a year. The 400 members of the tribe have nice new houses along the Tamiami Trail and nice new utes to park outside them. But as Buffalo Tiger says, money isn't everything.
I don't care how much money I have. I don't care where I live. I cannot forget who I am. All the trees here, they have to live like I do. I don't think anybody have common sense to see if you post them at there, they're gonna die. Sooner or later, they're gonna die.
To prevent the deaths of the plants and animals that still live in their traditional lands, the Miccosukee have used their newfound wealth. They've taken big sugar to court to force it to reduce its pollution, and won. And gradually, even big sugar's attitudes have changed. Last year, after 5 years of hard negotiation, the sugar companies have signed on with the cities and counties of South Florida, the state and federal governments, and the Miccosukee themselves to a $14 billion, 25-year plan to save the Everglades.
The environment has got to be an equal priority. That's been the mistake we've made here for the last 50 years.
Few conservationists ever thought they'd hear big sugar utter sentiments like these.
In the 40s, when we built this project, the environment was totally ignored, and the whole emphasis was on flood control primarily and water supply for the urban areas and agricultural as a second. And what we have today is we've seen that that's drastically impacted the environment. We would all agree there had to be a balance, and the environmental had to be on an equal footing.
Not that big sugar is being selfless. Its crops are crucially dependent on an ample supply of water. But the population of South Florida is still growing by leaps and bounds on both coasts. And all those new houses have 3 bathrooms each.
When it comes to the water supply for the urban areas on the coast versus agriculture, typically in this country, agriculture has been the one that suffered. And so we know that the best solution for us is a plan that provides water for agriculture, the urban coast, the environment, and everybody.
The new plan is as much about storing more water as it is about returning its natural flow to the Everglades. All around Lake Okeechobee, there'll be new reservoirs on the surface, and more than 200 wells drilled deep underground, where in flood times water can be stored instead of being channeled out to sea. In dry seasons, that water will be pumped up again. It'll first irrigate the sugar fields, then be cleaned up and allowed to flow south. In the Everglades, tens of kilometers of drainage canals will be filled in and levees torn down. the Tamiami Trail will be raised along much of its length to allow water to pass freely underneath. If the engineering of the plan is challenging, the politics are worse.
That's the only way that we're going to get buy-in from agriculture and urban and the environmental communities, is to show that substantially increasing the amount of water we're storing in the system, that there's something in it for everyone.
Something for everyone, perhaps, but not enough to satisfy the seaside sparrowman.
I can hear him singing. So we've got an unmarked territory where the orange flag is that right?
We've got an unmarked territory there. And then...
At dawn on the sawgrass prairie of the Everglades National Park, Professor Stuart Pym and his colleague David O'Kynes are trying to catch the elusive and officially endangered Cape Sable seaside sparrow.
We're going to have to move the net.
Each year, in the sparrow's brief nesting season, Professor Pym and his team return to count and catch and tag each individual bird, if they can find them. Professor Pym's an expert on the conservation of endangered species, a feisty Englishman who doesn't mince his words.
You know, if a group of people all get together and decide as a consensus statement that the sun rises in the west, it still ain't so.
When the so-called Everglades Restudy Plan came out, after years of haggling by the vested interests of southern Florida, along came Dr. Pym to say it wouldn't do. Worse still, he rounded up a goodly number of his scientific peers to join him.
And the fact that they objected to it should alert us to the fact that this is not being a successful ecological restoration. That's crucial, because the $4 billion of federal funds for this restoration is based on it being an ecologically sound restoration. It is not.
The plan as it stands, the scientists told the Secretary of the Interior, won't provide the wide variety of wetland habitat the park needs if Everglades species are ever to build back their depleted numbers. The result? An undertaking by the Chief of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that restoring the ecology of the Everglades National Park would be the top priority of the restudy plan. And that made Bubba Wade an angry man.
We went through a process for 6 years in South Florida with a governor's commission, a task force where the federal agencies and all of the state agencies and all of the concerned stakeholders in South Florida had a consensus process, agreed on a plan, packaged it in the restudy plan, and then 2 months later the chief of engineers recommends to Congress something totally different from what's in the report. And we saw that as an absolute issue of mistrust and not being able to trust the federal government.
But if the sugarmen are angry, the Miccosukee are angrier still. While the national park scientists squabble and argue, they say, their land is drowning. Sandwiched between the agricultural area to the north and the Everglades National Park to the south, the part of the Everglades the Miccosukee lease is unromantically named Water Conservation Area 3A. And in fact, it's a reservoir. Ron Jones, an ecologist from the nearby Florida International University, took me out from Buffalo Tigers Island to see the result. Now in the dry season, there should be at most a few centimeters depth of water here. In fact, it's more than a meter deep, and even the marsh grasses are drowning.
Come down here and look at this plant. It's a plant called Elaeochris, and it's essentially a very mainstay plant of the marsh out here. And it's ordinarily it would be quite wide. This blade would be able to, if I was holding this up, it would be able to support itself. And what's happened is that the water levels have come up so high and so quick out here that this plant tried to grow to keep this portion of it out of the water.
Yeah.
And, well, you can see that it has managed to do that, but as the water levels recede, then of course then it falls down in the water, and then you end up with this this dead, rotting material here, and you've obviously killed off a species that requires wet conditions. You know, basically 365 days a year, we've managed to drown out those types of plants. It's really remarkable. I never thought I would see anything, you know, like this.
Ron, when I see, you know, pictures of the Everglades, you have visions of marsh like this covered in water birds, hundreds and thousands of them. I haven't seen hardly any.
Yeah, I mean, it's been this kind of area, the birds weren't dumb enough to try and land in. You know, they need scuba gear.
It's not just the wading birds that are in trouble. The deep water has drowned the deer and the raccoons and even the hardwood trees on the Miccosukee Islands. Though it's as crucial a part of the Everglades system as any other, nobody but the Miccosukee cares about Water Conservation Area number 3, says Ron Jones. Least of all, the Everglades National Park. It's delayed for 10 years emergency measures that could have helped this water flow out through the park. It's delaying the long-term restoration plan by its calls for further study. And to add insult to injury for the Miccosukee, right now the park is insisting that the sluice gates under the Tamiami Trail stay closed to protect one small brown bird.
The gates are closed because on the other side of the road is a subspecies, the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, that they're trying to protect, and they're doing that by trying to dry out the habitat for it. Unfortunately, by doing that, they're flooding the habitat on the other side of the road.
But Stuart Pym is unapologetic. The park, he says, has a legal obligation to protect endangered species. And this is one of them.
I have worked on more charismatic species than this one, but I have worked in few places that are so spectacular and so internationally important as the Everglades. And if we allow even obscure brown birds to go extinct on our national parks, it doesn't say very much for how well we're managing those national parks.
But we're standing here in the Sawgrass Prairie, as we should be able to do at this time of year, on dry land, and only a few miles further north, there's 4 foot of water, and part of the reason is that you're keeping this dry artificially to save this bird, isn't that right?
Oh, I am not happy by the fact that there is a large amount of water pooled up to the north of us. I think it is an example of how badly the water is being managed in this system. But to blame that on the sparrow is to miss the point. You have to get the science right, and I'm arguing that we haven't got the science right yet. We have to get it right because nature will be very unforgiving if we get it wrong.
Yet nature can be astonishingly resilient. Given a chance, it can recover from the shocks that human beings subject it to. That may still happen here. But as Buffalo Tigers learned in his long life, the clash of human egos and interests, and above all, the lure of money, don't often give nature the chance it needs.
If they're going to leave it alone and take some dikes away from that, let the water flow, if they did that, then glades be here. They could survive. But people only think money is the thing, and we're going to have to start thinking another way. I think we fight in nature trying to kill that. We have to face, if we do that, we're not going to be in good shape.